Greetings from Houston. Again, my name is Danny Madrid-Morales, and I'm assistant professor at the University of Houston. And in this presentation, I want to look at one of the aspects of China-Africa media relations that is less explored. We know quite a bit about the people working for some of these organizations. We know quite a bit about the messages that are being created, but we know very little about how audiences engage with some of the content that is provided by Chinese global media. And again, I'm focusing on the case of Africa. Africa, as we know, probably is the area of the world where we see the largest concentration of activities by Chinese state actors and non-state actors in the media sector. Let me give you a quick overview of what are the specific characteristics of the case of China and Africa. And I'll start with this idea that I borrowed from Park and Alden of the two dimension in the space of Sino-African relations. And that is that all encounters between China and Africa have a two dimension. There's an upstairs dimension and a downstairs dimension. The upstairs dimension meaning the engagement between elites, and the downstairs, the engagement between people to people. And that would include both the more institutionalized option, which is things like the Confucius Institute or some of the celebrations that take place or the events that take place in Africa and organized by China, but also the non-institutionalized exchanges that are mostly occurring naturally between citizens of China and African countries. So in these two dimensions, and if we look at the case of the media specifically, we know very little about the downstairs dimension of China-Africa media relations. Even though the field has been widely explored, we don't know that much about this downstairs dimension. And what we know is it comes from two types of studies, right? One is there's a few now starting to age a little bit fast number of studies that have looked at how audiences engage with content, but those have been done with like very small sample sizes in very specific contexts. The studies of African students in China, there's studies on South African students watching some of this content, but we don't know much about this specific downstairs dimension. All we know as a broader context is work by Bailard, who has looked at correlations between the presence of Chinese media and attitudes towards China. And she has shown that there's actually a positive relationship between the two. And the wider the presence of Chinese media, the more positive the perception and attitudes are towards China. But that's pretty much all we know. So we will need to look at the upstairs dimension to try to get a few more ideas, right? And if we specifically think about elites, we know quite a bit more about how elites engage with this kind of content, and we also have quite a bit of geographic diversity. We know how Ghanaian, Kenyan, Malian, South African, different countries have been explored, and that's mostly has to do with how journalists engage with this content, right? So in my own work with Herman Wasserman, with whom I am co-authoring this paper, we have looked at how journalists in South Africa and Kenya engage with this content. And we engage with some of the literature that I'm presenting you here in Mali, in Ghana, and in a few other countries. And what we have found is that journalists tend to express some hesitation towards embracing Chinese media. And that has to do oftentimes with their attitudes towards China. So they have a negative attitude towards China, and therefore they are less likely to engage with content. But at the same time, we've seen quite a few journalists who are quite sympathetic towards finding Chinese media the same way that they are happy with finding Russian media from Qatar, from other countries, which they see as alternative media. Based on what we found here and what we know, we have come up with this sort of typology of users that goes from those that we call adopters. Those are people who have a favorable view of China and also have adopted Chinese media. And when we say adopted, that means anything between daily watching or watching everyday CGTN to watching CGTN more or less frequently. Then we also have the unconvinced, and those are people who have a neutral opinion towards China but haven't adopted Chinese media. We also identified a few resistors, who are those. They are those that have a negative view and haven't adopted Chinese media. And we also have the pragmatists, who are those that have a negative view but nonetheless still watch or consume some Chinese media because they think it's important for them to know what's going on. So that's the context. And the context is that we know little about audiences and that what we know mostly has to do with elites. So in this paper, we're trying to extend what we know about elites to regular folks. And for that, we've tried to contextualize this in the specific context of before and after COVID-19. We know that COVID-19 has had a negative or a positive impact, depending on how you look at it. For sure, it has had an impact on China-African relations, right? On the one side, China has been very active in providing help and assistance to African countries. But at the same time, China has been at the center of several debates that have portrayed China in sort of like a negative light, right? Whether it's the origin of the virus, whether it's issues about loan forgiveness in Africa. China has been at the center of debates around COVID-19 in the media for quite a while, and that might have had a negative impact. Another important reason why COVID is such a significant milestone in the relationship between China and Africa in the media sector is because the media, Chinese media, have been very active in their communication towards African audiences of COVID-19. We've seen CGTN, Xinhua, we've seen Twitter being very active. We've also seen Star Times engaging with content specifically about COVID-19. So all of this has led to what this paper is looking at, which is 5 broadly defined research questions. And those are still in the making. We just finished collecting data about the COVID-19 period. So you'll forgive me, some of the results that I'm presenting here are just very preliminary. So what we're going to do here is we are going to try to explain or quantify the audience size, how many people are watching CGTN, how many people are reading China Daily. We're also trying to explain what are people's views of Chinese media. And then we're going to try to relate that somehow to attitudes towards China. As I've shown you before, there seems to be a relationship between consumption and attitudes, and we want to explore this two-way relationship. And then we also want to look at whether Chinese media's consumption has changed over time and whether attitudes have changed over time, right? And for that, we're going to use 2 studies. So I'm going to divide my presentation between study 1 and study 2. Study 1 includes South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya, while study 2 only includes Kenya and South Africa. So we are going to be able to compare study 1, which was done early 2018, to study 2, which was done just a few weeks finishing Nigerian data. So it is a very recent data that I'm presenting you here. So for study 1, we had an exploratory survey, about 870 people, and that was conducted in Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa in a non-representative sample of the population in 2018. Now in study 2, we have collected about 2,000 responses, plus 1,000 more from Nigeria that I'm not going to include here. And that was fielded between April and May 2020. And that looks at, and that's a representative sample of the population, right? So here we were able to mimic gender, age, and location and residence. So it is a much more representative sample in study 2 than study 1. And what I'm going to try to do is compare some of the results in each of these 2 studies. Some of the things that we looked at for each of the studies are, there's quite a few variables. I'm going to say that the surveys were quite wide, but I'm going to present about 3 specific variables. One has to do with media consumption. We asked people about what kind of media they consume, and we made this a open sort of approach where people could choose multiple media. We also look at media perception, so how do people think and rank Chinese media? And we also look at country attitudes, so how do people perceive China? So let me go into the findings. Let me start with audience size. We asked people in 2018 rank what is the TV station that they use regularly to watch the news, and we found that the percentage of people who say that they watch CGTN is quite small. It is much more in South Africa than in both Kenya and Nigeria. Only approximately 7% of the population in Kenya and 8% in Nigeria say they watch CGTN. And as you can see, that compares pretty negatively with other large players. Like if you look at BBC, which has almost 3 times the amount of audience that CGTN does, and CNN, for example, also is much higher. Even Sky News in South Africa has a higher audience than CGTN. Radio-wise, it's even worse data. We found that people who listen to CRI are a very small minority, less than 1% in other countries, and that applies also to China Daily. We looked at how many people say that they read China Daily, whether it's online or on paper, and we found that less than 1% in most countries, 1.3. Those are very small numbers, so there's a significant margin of error. Therefore, don't take those numbers, and those differences are non-significant. So all 3 countries have very small numbers of readership, and it's not that international media is consumed by these countries very much. So if you look at the bottom of these graphs, you'll see that it's mostly domestic media that people read, which is expecting. expectable because people tend to read domestic media more than foreign media. But when you compare China Daily to other global players like New York Times or The Guardian, in all of the cases, China Daily has much less readership than the other international media. So that has to do with audience, and we found very small audiences. What about perceptions? Well, you'll be a bit overwhelmed with all these numbers. There's a lot of numbers here. The way this works is that we ask people to rank these 5 media houses, Al Jazeera, BBC World, CGTN, CNN, and RT, on 4 dimensions. We will ask them whether they cover Africa well, whether people know these media, whether they trust them, and whether they tell the truth. And what I'm coloring here is that the darker colors mean that people rank them from 1 to 5 at the top. So for each dimension, we ask them to rank them from 1 to 5. And if you look carefully, CGTN being the middle one, you'll see that with Kenyans, CGTN is always performing around the 3rd place. That means behind the 4th place, that's behind CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera. When we look at Nigerian data, we see that CGTN is constantly being scored on the 3rd position. So that's behind CNN and BBC. The 4th position, behind CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera. But ahead from RT. RT is always performing worse than any in all the 4 countries, in all the 3 countries. While in the case of South Africa, CGTN outperforms Al Jazeera in some of the metrics, but is performing much worse than CNN and BBC. So here the summary would be, right, that CGTN is less well known than BBC and CNN. People trust CNN, BBC more than they trust CGTN, and people think that CNN and BBC cover Africa better than CGTN, which is specifically interesting because CGTN has probably the best coverage of Africa these days, but people's attitudes are not exactly like that. Okay, let me move to the 3rd research question, the last one from study 1, in which we tried to look at attitudes towards China. And we saw that generally speaking, and again, there's a lot of colors here, the lighter colors, the ones on the left, show people who have disagreement with some of the statements that we provided them with. And then darker colors, or the measures on the left, are people who agree with some of the statements. And you see the statements here on the left-hand side. So I'm going to give you an overview. The orange color, the yellow color means that there's a neutral position around this statement. Green means favorable, and red means unfavorable. So if you look here, in 2018, there was a very neutral attitude towards China in all 4 dimensions. So in politics, in economic impact, willingness to go and move and live in China, in all of those dimensions, it was a very neutral. That's what this yellow is meaning on the side, right? So if you look at the scales, you'll see that Kenyans, Nigerians, South Africans had a very neutral opinion towards the media. They had a relatively neutral opinion towards the political situation in China. And the only one that was clearly negative was South Africans thinking that they do not want to go and work and live in China, while the most positive of these statements was the one that said that China has a positive influence on Africa. That's where people agreed the most. That's what the green means. And I want you to keep these colors in mind because I'm going to show you the comparison with 2020 in a minute. Okay, let me move to study 2, where we compare the results of 2018 to 2020. So the first thing that we want to do is compare whether people consume Chinese media more than they used to. And our findings show that there's no significant change. So you'll see here data for South Africa and Kenya. We don't have data for Nigeria yet. And you'll see that there's pretty much no change in how many people say that they watch CGTN to get their news. The same thing can be said about CRI. The numbers were low in 2018 and they continue to be very low in 2020. And then we also see the same thing with China Daily, which has barely increased, mostly because people read it online, but there's no significant change. Okay, last question that I want to talk about is comparing attitudes before and after COVID-19, right? So 2018, that's before COVID, 2020 after COVID. Now, if you remember the colors that we had before, there was a lot of yellow. Now we see a lot of red. So our first analysis of this would be that there's been a negative impact on attitudes towards China because of COVID-19, right? So we measured this way before COVID and right in the middle of COVID, and you can see that in several dimensions, China's view towards China has worsened. And I can compare the means. Here we have a scale from 0 to 4, where 0 means very negative and 4 means the most positive view. And as you can see, in all of the statements, there's been a decrease. All of them are below 2, so that means below the average mark. And only this idea that China has a positive impact on Africa remains a thing that is positive according to the views of Kenyans and South Africans. So let me give you 4 final ideas, and with this I'll finish. I'm slightly over my time. 1, we found that Chinese media operating in Africa have very limited direct reach on the downstairs part of the population, right? So people who are supposed to be watching these are not watching or reading the media. 2, CGTN underperforms compared to BBC and CNN, but outperforms RT and Al Jazeera. That attitudes towards China are not likely to be influenced by the media, given how few people actually watch some of this content. And finally, we think that COVID-19 has had quite a negative impact on attitudes towards China, and probably we need more research on this area and looking in the long term, maybe exploring how things change in the future. And that's all I wanted to present to you today. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me or to Dr. Wasserman, Professor Wasserman. Both of us be happy to answer your questions.